Welcome to A Little Bit Radical, a business podcast from Standing on Giants. I'm Rob, your host. Join me as I meet people and organisations who are doing things differently, challenging the status quo, and yes, might just be a little bit radical. Surf's up, people. My guest today is Bronwen Foster-Butler, Chief Marketing Officer of Finisterre. Often called the British Patagonia, Finisterre are leaders in sustainable fashion inspired by the sea. I personally have a very nice blue turtleneck from Finisterre on as we're recording this interview. They're a certified B Corp and through the Finisterre Foundation contribute to projects that help preserve our seas. Bronwen herself is a seasoned marketer with brands like Lululemon, Burberry and Pangaea on her CV. Let's get cracking. Bronwen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's thrilled to be here. And I loved the surf's up.
Oh, thank you. That was just for you. That was just for you and the team at Finisterre. Yeah.
I can tell you're a real surfer.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Anyone who's seen me try will have had an experience, put it that way. So, Bronwen, if you are a little bit radical and you're on our podcast, so we know that you are, what in your early life set you up for that?
Well, I think I was born to some pretty radical people. I was actually born not entirely on an island in the Canadian wilderness, but my mum went into labor on that island and the doctor had to come and get her. And it was the middle of the night and there was a lightning storm and a full moon and they crossed the lake desperately trying not to be struck by lightning. And that kind of birth story certainly shaped the rest of my life. I was also the third born, so I had to be a bit more radical just to be fed and noticed and remembered and not left in the shopping centre, etc. And I think also having a peculiar name has shaped my lived experience.
That's interesting. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent my entire life having to explain my name, it never being pronounced correctly, or people always passing comment of like, oh, where's that from? Or that's peculiar. Or like, what's your first name? I'm like, no, that is my first name. Bronwen, it's a Welsh name. It's in the Arthurian tales, etc. So there was always sort of, again, lots of like storytelling and a slightly radical or different framing to who I was. And I think that has created what I talked to my therapist about at length is I feel like I'm someone who likes to play in the edges and likes to sort of push buttons, I would say, probably more than boundaries, definitely like pushing buttons.
Oh, so many interesting things in there. I mean, first of all, your birth story sounds like the opening chapter of a children's book, The Storm, and she went into labor. She was born under a full moon. Now you've tied that to your name as well. It sounds like you've often felt different because of that, but then you've chosen to act different as well, which is interesting.
Yeah, I don't know which comes first. Again, probably need to dig into that with my therapist a bit.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah. Well, it reminds me of labeling theory, right? You know, the idea that if you're called a certain thing, then you will, begin to act like it. And as an adult, do you think you've become more or less radical? And what's been behind that?
I definitely think in my 20s, I became a bit mainstream, I'd say, just in like that need of like trying to figure out who I was as an adult. And so in order to do that, it's easier to just kind of follow everybody else. I definitely lost confidence. And, when early in your career, I wasn't making any money. All my money was going on rent. There was no wiggle room to figure out how to express myself. Like I had to take the easiest path in some ways. And it was only as I got older that I felt as though I had the confidence, the experience also to recognize and to develop some intuition around like, okay, what actually makes me feel good? What makes me feel better? What fills my cup? And equally develop that instinctiveness or self-awareness, I think is the better word, around what depletes me, what makes me feel bad, what am I not drawn to? And so through that, I think I have come full circle back to recognizing that being slightly more radical and pushing buttons, like I said, and playing in those edges is something that fills me with joy. And especially becoming a parent, and especially becoming a parent to a daughter during COVID, really just reignited my sense of, it's sort of like the feminist cause, I suppose, and recognizing where as a woman in the workplace, I'd accepted the downgrade or accepted the hypocrisy of society as like, oh, that's the status quo. I remember telling my boss I was pregnant with her and then immediately apologizing. And then when I gave birth to her, I just felt this incredible joy and sadness that I'd ever apologized for her. So I'll never apologize for her again.
No, of course not. I'm sure you're not the first woman to feel like that and who's had that kind of experience. I love watching the work of Pregnant Then Screwed. Have you heard of them? You've seen them, all the incredible work they're doing. Sounds like you felt pregnant then screwed in a way at the time.
Yeah, I remember a boss early in my career saying like, oh, well, do you want to get a promotion or are you going to become a parent?
Wow.
And I was like, oh, I didn't realize that was a choice I had to make. And it was just said so naturally. And it was said by a female leader too. I was like, wow, okay, well, if she's saying this, then yeah, that's the choice I'm going to have to make.
This is one of my personal favorite sort of shticks at the moment, which is the 20th century workplace is set up kind of obviously for men, but every element of it is the 5 days, the consistent, we do this exact same thing all year, and then you have your breaks. It completely ignores the fact that women have a menstrual cycle, for example, where you have different energy at a different time. When you get pregnant, you have peaks and troughs. I mean, for men as well. I'm a parent now as well of a young toddler, and my God, I have peaks and troughs. Like, I can't show up in exactly the same way every day,
Yeah.
And I think in modern life, you can't show up in the exact same way for the exact same hours every day.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about how at Finisterre you work on that problem and you approach flexibility and support for parents and support for different groups who need that kind of inclusivity.
I mean, I'm lucky in that our founder, Tom Kay, he is an incredibly hands-on parent himself. He's also an RNLI helmsman, so his life has to be flexible because we'll be in the middle of a meeting and if his beeper goes, he's off to save someone at sea.
Oh my God, wow.
Which has happened.
Talk about priorities, right? In perspective. Like, yeah, this financial forecast is really important.
Exactly. It's like, but I just have to go save someone's life now. And then our entire C-suite are working parents. And so what's brilliant is that we're all really here to make a difference, to build this brand and to be something incredible. And none of us are willing to make a sacrifice in our family lives. So it's the first place I've worked where Will, our CEO, half the time I'm calling him, he's on the school run or he's at school sports day or he's like chatting to the boys in the background. He's recently made some life choices in order to enable his wife to really recommit to her career. And seeing that is really a breath of fresh air. Also recognizing that they're able to do that from a place of privilege, because when women have tried to do that, it has been a criticism. And when men do it, it's celebrated. And it's still a net positive that as leaders, especially of the organization, that they're leaning into that and they're making it okay for us to do so as well. Whilst also working really hard. And we all work kind of at all hours. I think this 9 to 5 thing is just, to your point, it doesn't work with neurodiversity. It doesn't work with anyone who's a caregiver. Like I've got people in my team who have dogs. And it's like, if you're a dog parent, you've got different needs too. Our office down in Cornwall is regularly just filled with dogs everywhere, which is beautiful. But I also think a reflection of like, oh yeah, if you're a parent to an animal, you're also a caregiver. And so in my work mentality, because it's how I can deliver, it's about getting the job done, not when you get it done. Mm-hmm. And at Finisterre, we're lucky enough to still have hybrid working. We're 3 days a week in the office. We have quite a few remote workers. We're just well set up for someone's always dialing in. So like no one's getting forgotten by somebody not dialing into the call or anything. And when the surf comes, it doesn't matter what meetings are in the diary, everyone's going to be in the sea.
I was going to say, I'm pretty sure that you did a lot of surfing down at Finisterre. So is that the rule? When the surf's up, we need to go surfing, yeah.
Well, I don't think our HR team would say it's necessarily the rule, but it's definitely the culture. And every Tuesday morning, we have something called Sea Tuesday, where we start at 10 instead of 9. And the first hour of the day is an opportunity for everyone to reconnect with the sea. Surfing is quite like individualistic because you don't want to have a crowded wave. So the surfers will all chat in splinter groups about which beach they're going to, where the surf looks good. And then the swimmers will go, okay, we're going to all meet at this beach and go and jump in the sea together. And then we meet up at 10 for an all hands meeting in our office, which are these beautiful old mining buildings called Wheel Kitty, right overlooking Trevonance Cove and St Agnes in North Cornwall. And everybody's dripping wet. There's wetsuits hanging in the meeting rooms. There's dogs coming in and shaking off. It's a beautiful reflection of the core values of the company.
That's fantastic. Well, I think that we've heard about your culture now. It's time to give people a bit of background of why all these people are going surfing and swimming in the sea whilst they're at work. So take us back to the founding story of Finisterre and how the brand has grown and what you do and all of that wonderful stuff.
Absolutely. So we were founded by Tom Kay 20 years ago in Cornwall. Tom was bobbing out at sea on his surfboard, frozen cold. There was sideways rain. He was alone because that's the beauty of...
It is Cornwall after all.
Yeah. This was August. And he realized that the surf industry wasn't catering to surfers like him. So the first 8 ads in any surf magazine was board shorts and bikinis and flip-flops. It was the California lifestyle, Hawaii and Australia. It wasn't cold water surf. It wasn't frozen fingers and gray skies and vast empty waves at beaches that people didn't even know they could access. And equally, at the same time, there was also the product that was being created for surfing was often being done so at the expense of the ocean. So there was this hypocrisy where the lifestyle was all about reconnecting to the sea and being in the sea and the ocean and the sea, like it's our playground. And here, let's make a whole bunch of stuff out of petrochemicals, which, by the way, is killing the sea. And so he had this vision for Finisterre of being a brand that was catering to cold water surf and that was doing so with the minimal impact as possible on the ocean.
That's really beautiful, isn't it? And I feel like you've summed up there what I love about talking to people on this podcast and hearing about these businesses, and that the way you phrased it, such a simple realization and kind of an obvious thing. Of course, the board that I surf on, the clothes that I wear when I'm doing this shouldn't be destroying the habitat that enables me to go surfing. Really good example of just how messed up our world has become at certain times, right? You know? So where did he go from there? And then how have you got to the point today?
So the first product Tom made was a slightly waterproof fleece. It was 100 pounds, which even like 20 years ago, that was super spenny. It was 3/4 zip. So the idea being you could get out of the sea, your fingers are frozen, but you can get your sleeves off your wetsuit off and then throw this fleece on. Our fleeces have always had a really high wool content, and wool keeps you a lot warmer than polyester, which goes into the majority of fleeces that you see on the market are polyester blend. I also had this slight water repellent, just as it's Cornwall. That's required.
Of course, yeah.
We still see them to this day. They were so well made and they're so hardy that, we'll still see them floating around, which is pretty cool. And from there, it was launched as an online-only brand. In fact, if you go back into web archives, you can still see the original 3-page website. I mean, it's laughable now, but at the time was cutting edge. And from there, it grew slowly, but always grew. And a big part of the brand for Tom was really beautiful storytelling and emotional storytelling that stirs people's soul and makes them care. There's something about, for anyone who's lucky enough to get to spend time in the ocean, it really is a spiritual relationship. We're not meant to be in the ocean.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You are so present anytime you're there because you have to be. Is there a seal coming? What's the tide doing? Is there a rogue wave coming? Is there a boat coming? You are just completely present in that experience.
In my case, is there a crab coming on the
coming?
The Isle of Wight? You're telling huge truths which are resonating with me growing up with every single one of my holidays for 18 years being on the Isle of Wight. In the, we never went abroad. We always went to the Isle of Wight. Very similar coastline and sea experience to Cornwall.
Yeah.
And I was terrified of crabs. And there's so many there. And like you say, being in the sea gives you a real sense of your own kind of insignificance, but also a nice connection to nature. And that's what you were saying around being in the sea is a very kind of spiritual experience, right?
The storytelling around Finisterre has always reflected that. You'll never just see a pretty photo of a fleece. There's always a way more behind that. There's way more of a story. Sure, sometimes you'll see a shot of a fleece, but the person wearing it, the place it was shot, we'll always create content around any shoot that we do, of the places we go, the people we're with. And that storytelling, Tom injected into the brand right from day one. And that radical thinking has been there since day one too. First of all, of just like not accepting the status quo that surf is only for warm water and also only for beautiful bodies. there was a lot of like Tom being like, hang on, the people I see in the ocean around me who are way better surfers don't look like that chiseled Aussie guy with the long blonde hair. So how can we bring in a little bit broader representation of who's actually doing the sport and being in the ocean? From there, he was constantly just, and still is constantly pushing us to just change things and challenge the status quo. We work with this incredible woman, Leslie Pryor, who is the owner and shepherd of a flock of Beaumont sheep, who are the last British merino producing flock.
Oh, wow.
And if nobody was going to invest in Leslie, then British merino was going to be gone. And all the merino would be reliant upon would be New Zealand and Australia and then across Asia. And we didn't think that was a good thing. So we worked together with Leslie to grow the flock. It took a number of years. The flock's now over 300 and commercialized it. I think the first collection was in 2012. And every year we sell the Beaumont collection. It's always the same color, but always a different pattern. It's like an off-white and a blue. It's always some of our most expensive product. We don't even have to work that hard to sell it now because our audience are just so in love with the Beaumont story and the quality, etc., that it just flies off the shelves. And for a small brand to have the balls to put out something that's probably more expensive than people can find, that is only ever available in 2 colors, and is certainly not the cheapest merino you can find, but continue to invest in that. There's just stories like that all the way across the history of the last 20 years.
Fantastic.
And we've got Beaumont slippers actually coming out this Christmas, which would be pretty cool.
Ooh, on my Christmas list straight away. So you're constantly innovating, constantly pushing to be a little bit more radical. How can we do things differently? What's an example of something that you've brought to life in the last year or two that kind of fits that bill as well?
Well, a number of years ago, we launched our first wetsuit, and 99.9% of wetsuits on the market are made out of neoprene. And neoprene's pretty nasty. It's a petrochemical, so it comes from oil. And what we have learned in the last, to be fair, not even in the last year, but last January, we saw a film that is called The Big Sea, and it's coming out soon. And it has essentially blown open the whole wetsuit industry, because what it's showing us is that the production of neoprene, there's a chemical component called chloroprene. It comes from petrochemicals. It's turned into chloroprene. That makes neoprene. Chloroprene is produced in an area of the United States called Cancer Alley. It's in Louisiana. It's along the Mississippi.
Cancer Alley.
Yep. You can Google it. The Guardian have done articles on it. And the inhabitants in particular, there's one parish where if you look at rates of cancer across the US, there's sort of a heat map. And there's one area, most areas are sort of like pale yellow. And then you see the whole Mississippi is orange. And then there's one parish that is dark brown. And that parish has a cancer rate that's 50 times higher than the national average. And it is home to a factory owned by a company called Denka. And Denka are making chloroprene, which is making neoprene for wetsuits. And even worse, Denka use the image of surfing to promote themselves and to sort of greenwash who they are as a business. And yet the production of those wetsuits and the production of chloroprene and, to be honest, Denka's consistent and persistent denial of the connection to the cancer rates in the community. And the community generally also are poor and Black. I mean, there's a school next to the Denka factory. It's shameful. And they're consistently lobbying against any sort of protection for the inhabitants. And this film came out, and surfers are a bit of a rebellious bunch. And also over the last decade in particular, we have seen an awakening to the environmental impact of surf. And it just didn't sit right, especially for the documentary filmmakers who are both surfers, that surfers consider themselves caretakers of the ocean, and their ability to be in the ocean shouldn't come at the expense of someone's life. And it was that intersectional environmentalism of like, okay, not only is neoprene a petrochemical, so that's coming at the expense of the environment, now we have a direct link to how it's coming at the expense of humans. And so prior to The Big Sea coming out, we had actually already switched, because of the petrochemical issue, we had switched to a material called Ulex. Ulex was developed by Patagonia. Ulex is a company out of California, and it's a natural rubber component, so it's not using petrochemicals. And we are now completely neoprene free, have been for a number of years. And I think we're actually one of the only brands in the world that's neoprene free, which is pretty cool. And our wetsuits are great. They work just as well. They're really warm, really flexible, incredibly durable. So they last for longer than most neoprene suits on the market. And they come with a much better impact on both the humans and the environment.
What a great story. Well, and a horrifying story, but a great example of a business taking action and not just accepting that this is the way it is now. And I think you're so right, like being in touch with your consumers, right? The surfing community, I'm sure, is not willing to accept that people have to die for them to do their sport. I don't know who would be. So fantastic that you're leading the way there. But I gather that there was some skepticism to whether the suits were going to be as good. So you've introduced a kind of a method to help people kind of try before they buy. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest criticisms of Ulex has been that it isn't as good as neoprene. And certainly, the first generation wasn't. It was a bit stiffer. It was not as comfortable as a neoprene suit, but it has moved a long way since then. And this spring, there was Tom bobbing in the sea outside of Falmouth, and he met this young surfer, and the surfer came over and he's like, "Oh, I saw the big sea, this documentary. Like, it's terrible. I'm never going to buy a neoprene suit again." Tom was like, "Oh, that's awesome." He's like, "But man, your suits are expensive." And it's true. Ulex suits are more expensive than a neoprene suit. And for Tom, this just didn't sit right. How can we help break down this barrier? And at the same time, we also hear from our customers that I hear you on the Ulex, but it's not as good as neoprene. So I'm just going to keep my neoprene suit for longer and not trade across, which of course, keeping the suit they own is certainly the best thing. But when it comes time to buy the next suit, we felt as though there was an opportunity to hit two birds with one stone. First of all, break down the financial barrier. And second of all, break down the perception barrier. And so we launched the world's first Ulex wetsuit rental program. It's online only. It launched just in time for summer holidays this summer. You can go on and for £4 a day, you can rent a world-class Ulex wetsuit, take it on holiday, try it out, see that it works, figure out the size that works for you, the thickness that works for you, look pretty cool in front of your mates as well as lovely, and then return it. And especially if you're a Londoner, like the last thing I need is wetsuits that take a couple of days to dry, just hanging around my tiny little place in London.
Yeah, space is a premium, yeah.
Yeah. And so many people just use the wetsuit for their one beach break a year, and then they have it sat in mothballs for the rest of the year. So actually, if you can send it back, it will be cleaned, taken care of, sent out to someone else. And then the next time you need one, you can rent one again. And again, it's a fraction of the price. Equally, if you try it and you love it, then you can buy it at the end of your rental as well. So pretty cool. And it's been really well received. It's blown our minds, actually, just how popular it has been and successful it's been. So it's great.
I'm not surprised yet. £4 a day is very good value as well for a rental. I do the odd bit of cold water swimming and tend to, for reasons that you say, I don't own my own gear to do that. I don't do it often enough. But when I rent a wetsuit at the lake, it's £10 or £15, right? Just for that hour or whatever. So that's fantastic. You're giving people that opportunity. You've alluded to in this conversation around the importance of things lasting. And one of the quite radical things that Finisterre supports is repairing, right? Repairing clothes that you've bought from you. So I'm wearing this very fetching Finisterre turtleneck at the moment. So presumably if this gets a tear in it at some point, I'm allowed to send it back to you and you'll repair it. Is that right?
We sure will. Yeah. What's been so cool is, again, it was something that just evolved naturally. Of like a few years in, Tom started getting some jumpers sent back to him from his friends being like, "Hey, Tom, I was camping and an ash landed on this. Any chance you could patch it?" Or, "Hey, Tom, I was hiking and tripped and fell and got a hole in this. Any chance you can fix it?" So he just started fixing these things and found some local craftspeople within the Cornish community to come in. And then it just sort of grew naturally from there. And now we have, it's called Lived and Loved. We have an entire repairs team based out of our head office in St Agnes. We also have a repairs team based out of our Bristol store. You can go in, we can teach you how to darn your socks, show you how to darn your socks. You can also, we'll do it for you. If you lost a stitch in your knit jumper or the moths got to it, we could add some patches. We'll reproof your waterproof. So if after a few years, most waterproofs need reproofing, we can do that for you. But also what we're trying to do is really just get people to take care of their clothes. We all just buy way too much. And I remember even growing up, we didn't have the fast fashion and we didn't have that really cheap fashion. So even like the cheapest brands, you still had to save up for. We just didn't buy as much stuff. And now the rate we are consuming things and this sort of entitlement to our ability to consume things, like we expect it to be cheap and we expect it to be well made and we expect it to not damage the planet and we expect it to be trendy and to come to us the next day, hand delivered to our door. And I mean, the system's going to break at some point. And that might be the environmental system. That might not be the consumption system.
I was going to say, who's paying the price for that at the moment? Or what is paying the price for that the most, in your opinion, of that system that you so eloquently laid out there?
Unfortunately, the global south is mostly paying the price. So much of like our psyche is like, oh, it's okay because I'll just take it to a charity shop and that's good. The vast majority of clothes taken to a charity shop are shipped off to Africa, to Ghana in particular. There's an incredible market there, Katamaka market. And there it is just filled with secondhand clothes from Western societies, which is problematic because it actually hinders the ability for the local Ghanaian fashion market to build up into anything. Any clothes that aren't sold are then often incinerated, or if you Google photos of the Atacama Desert in Chile, they are just building a mountain of clothing there. And it's a giant landfill of fast fashion. And often, there's clothes there with their tags on it. And also because the majority of clothes we're buying now are polyester based, they're made out of plastic. Like your woolen jumper at the end of its life, if you buried that in your garden and checked back on it in a few years, it would pretty much all be gone. If you bury a piece of polyester in your garden and take it up after a few years, it's still going to be there. And so, unfortunately, right now, the global south is taking the hit. And I think the thing that we fail to recognize is that planetary well-being is humanitarian well-being. We are doing this to ourselves. I was thinking about it the other day, like remember just before COVID where the government was like, oh, it's okay, just wash your hands and sing happy birthday. That'll do it. That'll fix it. I kind of feel like we're at the equivalent stage of the climate crisis where it's like, it's okay, just recycle your plastic and switch to a hybrid or ride a bike a bit, and we're all going to be okay. I was like, we're not going to be okay if we aren't going to do anything radical. But like, here we are just washing our hands and singing happy birthday and going, oh, it's fine. I could just take my clothes to the charity shop, or like, I'll recycle my milk and we're all going to be all right.
I think that's a great way of putting it, that we're at the wash your hands and sing happy birthday twice stage. And actually, at the time of recording this, you will have seen that the UK government has announced a kind of series of rollbacks on environmental commitments. Bronwen, as a brand and a company that's so committed to the environment and doing things differently, how do announcements like that make you all feel? Have you discussed it internally? And what does it kind of do to you as a group of people trying your hardest to change the way we do things?
I mean, it's heartbreaking and galvanizing. It's just so frustrating as well, the fact that climate change has become such a political subject when it isn't going to matter what party you vote for. Some people aren't going to be okay. It's such a collective human experience. Although saying that, again, the global south is going to get hit first and already are way more than certainly in the UK. And so it's really easy to get disheartened. And we are lucky enough to be plugged into the activism space. We've been working with the team at Stop Rosebank. We've been working with the incredible guys at Surfers Against Sewage, so all about the sewage issues across the UK. Which, by the way, like in case listeners also don't understand, like we're the laughing stock of the world. I was at a conference last week and not many nations allow raw sewage to just be pumped, especially island nations allow raw sewage to just be pumped. It's an embarrassment, and it's astonishing that the British public are letting it happen. In those moments, it is so easy to get really frustrated, and we kind of call upon our resilience and our reserves to be like, okay, so what can we do? How can we get into action? So the week after Rishi announced that Rosebank was going ahead, we hosted events in all of our stores across the UK with the Stop Rosebank Coalition of how to stop an oil field. And we had, they were sellout events, people coming along. And if anything, they were even more galvanized than they had been before. When Surfers Against Sewage, they did a national day of protest back in the spring. And there we were all down in the sea, banging our pots, swinging our signs, bringing our community along and making people realize that there is something we can do. That climate anxiety is real, and I feel it. My team feel it. And I think the best antidote to anxiety is action. So just feel it, express it, identify it, and then go, okay, what is that one small thing I can do today that's going to help fight against this?
I love that. And the antidote to anxiety is action. Fantastic. And on the theme of the podcast, I like that you followed it up with just a little thing. I think often we can feel, like you say, like there's no point washing my hands and singing happy birthday, or metaphorically, or whatever the issue is. But actually, if you do something small, and I think what was also very relevant about what you just said was connecting with other people who feel the same way, and you can all do a little bit together, and then you feel a lot better. Do you think we're going to see more brands getting involved in activism the way that Finisterre do?
We're certainly seeing a lot of brands, especially in fashion. I don't know many brands that don't have a focus on sustainability, I say in quotations. Activism is sort of a step on from there. And I think disappointingly this year, what we've seen is because social media has become so black and white and cancel culture is so rampant that a lot of brands have lost their nerve when it comes to the activism space. I think we saw Pride this year was the quietest it's been in a decade because brands around the world were just like, oh, I'm not going there. I don't want to face the comments. And I think that's really sad. We did Pride. We went into it knowing the comments were going to come. And so we equipped ourselves and we protected our team to make sure that those of us in particular with cis hetero, we were the ones on the front line going, okay, we'll take on the comments that are perhaps ill-informed or full-on hate speech. Like we'll take that on, protect our team that for whom that would be a lot more impactful. And, there was days where I was starting to lose my nerve. The sheer energy behind the criticism and the hatred. And you can understand why some brands who don't have activism at their heart have shirked away from that responsibility. And even sadly, environmental issues now. You see brands post about it and you expect that 50% of the comments underneath, it's so much whataboutery. Oh yeah, but what about this? But what about that? The whataboutery isn't going to get us anywhere. There's no such thing as perfect when it comes to sustainability. And to your point of like little things, it's like we've got to fight for these little inches. Where are these little wins? And if we're all just doing little wins and we're doing it en masse and we're consistently doing it, like that's going to have the big collective impact.
I'm trying to come up with a good name for it at the moment. So you're the first person I'm trialing it on for this phenomenon. So at the moment, I'm calling it Gandhi or bust. So this sort of pervasive feeling that anyone who's trying to do anything good has to be like Mahatma Gandhi and like so 100% into it. Otherwise, it's completely irrelevant is ridiculous, right? Do you know who was helping Gandhi with his movement? All those millions of people behind him who were doing little things.
And who are perfectly flawed human beings.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, Gandhi or bust.
I am not upset if I see someone like H&M talking about sustainability. I'm upset if they're not doing it honestly. But frankly, at least they're talking about it because that means in their boardroom, they have all decided that this is something we actually have to start paying attention to. Even big oil, they're starting to say some things and it's like you can point a lot of fingers, but at least they're saying something. Like at least that means at a boardroom level, they have acknowledged this is something. Because again, it's this whataboutery. If people aren't even allowed to stick their toe in, then they're just going to retract and go back and go, okay, never mind. We're not going to pay any attention to that. And I think that goes for both humans and businesses and brands.
Absolutely. Very well put. So sadly, we're moving into the final section now, Bronwen. We've talked a lot about your engagement with the world, personally and professionally, but we're going to talk about a little bit radical world now. And what's a little bit radical change that you would like to see in the world at large that you'd like people to get behind?
I'd like to see more people vote at the next general election, in particular young people. I think we forget what a privilege it is to be able to vote. And I would like people to engage in politics, but I'd also like them to do so from a place of open-mindedness and not necessarily trying to make the other side wrong or evil, but actually, how do I engage in conversation with the other side to maybe help bring them along on the journey with me?
I'm very encouraged by the fact that I've sat down with a lot of people now for this podcast where they've said something similar, actually, where it's kind of time to have respectful debate. And actually, it was Alice, who's head of activism at the Body Shop, who said exactly the same thing as you just said. She's involved in a lot of campaigns to encourage younger people to vote, but also this idea of proper debating where it's not this kind of horrendous personal attack on each side, but exchange of ideas.
Yeah.
I'm finding it really interesting that the people I'm speaking to who are proudly activists are the ones who are championing respectful debate. And the people who don't do any activism don't do any debate, but would vilify activists saying, oh, they're the problem. I'm finding that very interesting. So, Bronwen, this is the last question. It's always the same, which is that if there's someone listening to this podcast, and I continue to be amazed, people do listen to this podcast. Thank you. Love every single one of you. Yeah, exactly. Hi, Mum. Hi, Dad. Listening in the Tesla. If there's someone listening who has a little bit of a radical idea for their work, for their personal life, but doesn't know where to get started, what would you say to them?
On a very practical level, write it down.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. And then break it down to quote Frozen. What's the next best step?
Love that. Probably the best documentary I've ever seen about collaboration, feedback, and the creative process. The Making of Frozen 2. Here you go. Recommendation. You can watch it on Disney+. My God, absolutely amazing. And yeah. Love that you just quoted Frozen.
That's great. I'm going to watch that documentary too.
Oh, you'll love it. You'll love it. Write it down. So kind of about bringing it into being.
Yeah. And write the vision. We do a lot of vision and goals in my team. And I've done a lot of vision and goals personally in my life. And it's okay, write down that 10-year vision that I want. And so especially if you have an idea around something, what does it look like? And be really specific. Paint in all the details. And then break it down. With vision and goals, it was what are we going to do in 10 years, 5, and 1? So if you want to do this next year, you could also do, what am I going to do in a year from now, 6 months, tomorrow? And make them definitive. I'm quite ADD, so I get quite distracted. And so if I just write something on my list, buy birthday present for someone, I won't get it done. I actually have to write, think about what the birthday present should be, figure out where I'm going to buy it, arrange time in my diary to go and get it. Because then I get that lovely little dopamine hit every time I cross it off my to-do list too. And so I think if you want to do something a little bit radical, write down what your vision for that is, and then break down the steps. I think trickle back is a really great way of doing it, but whatever works for you, be really specific about all the steps that you need to do. Because if a goal's too big and too audacious, the weight of that is so easily all-consuming. But if there's tiny little goals along the way, it's the little bits. It's the little bits, the little inches.
Well, what a perfect point to end our time today. I love the point about be specific about little things. And that's the key to being a little bit radical. There you go, everyone. That's the name of the podcast. Bronwen, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing so much about Finisterre, about your personal life, and about what makes you tick. It's been fantastic. I hope to speak to you again soon.
Thanks so much, Rob. Surf's up.
Take care. Surf's up. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on your podcast platform. If you'd like to appear on A Little Bit Radical or have an idea of someone we should speak to, please email podcast@standingongiants.com or get in touch with me on LinkedIn. You can search Rob Fawkes or search Standing on Giants and you'll find me there. Thank you very much and speak to you next time.